The history of recent decades claims that the Russian Federation always seeks to sow chaos, instability, and lawlessness wherever its nasty little hands can reach. This policy became widespread back in the late Soviet period, but it reached its peak after the demise of the great and mighty Soviet Union. You could even say that making life difficult for their neighbors has become the main national pastime for Russians. Besides drinking, of course, analyzing Moscow's foreign policy in the post-Soviet space, I discovered a clear sequence and an actual algorithm behind all the hybrid wars it has started. A sort of universal scheme or template that the Russian authorities have always followed in everything they do. And they behave this way no matter who led the Kremlin, be it the often drunk Yeltsin or the ex-KGB officer from St. Petersburg. Today we will look at the 5 mandatory steps that were taken in Moscow to ignite military conflicts. The creation of unrecognized quasi-states and their further transformation into so-called gray zones. Into a territory where the laws of the Russian world apply, which in essence are not much different from the laws of the jungle. And then we will look at the next 5 steps that Russia took to maintain these very gray zones. As an example, I chose Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Transnistria, and of course the well-known to us Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. We will analyze the entire process of turning these regions into places of total poverty and hopelessness. If you like this format of presentation, be sure to write about it in the comments. And now, let's get started. My name is Semyon, this is the Mega Show television channel. Let's begin. The first 5 steps of Moscow. As I already said, today we have a somewhat unusual analysis. First, I will reveal these notorious first 5 points of the Kremlin's manuals, give them a brief description, and then we will look at the formation of gray zones according to this algorithm. We'll move from general to specific, using deduction, by the way. So let's all turn on Sherlock Holmes mode together. First, we need to broadly understand Moscow's strategic plans in the post-Soviet space. So, at the turn of the 80s and 90s, the unbreakable union of free republics is bursting at the seams, falling apart, dying. And finally, it died. And what should the great Russian state do in such a situation? The right thing to do is to recognize the remaining 14 republics as independent states and establish at least mutually beneficial, if not good neighborly, relations with them. But that's not possible. How can an empire exist if huge pieces of its territory have broken away? How can you just let go into free sailing the peoples who for centuries were destined to play the role of younger brothers or even just unwashed churroks? And what will people think of us on the world stage? That's just not acceptable. This is absolutely unacceptable. That's why Moscow formally recognized the post-Soviet states but still did everything possible to keep them under its control. By the way, the Commonwealth of Independent States was initially seen by the Kremlin as a universal tool for preserving its influence, but just an unsuccessful one. But what actually brought results were the hybrid wars that were unleashed and the artificially created pseudo-states, which prevented normal development and full integration with the Western civilized world. The victims of this policy were countries that, according to Russian authorities, sought to break from their Soviet past and live independently. Georgia, Moldova, and of course Ukraine were not so lucky. Now let's discuss the algorithm itself. Step 1. Find a region where certain contradictions or even conflicts already existed, possibly in a chronic form. Most often these were some kind of interethnic or interreligious tensions, especially if these peoples lived compactly in the same territory. A kind of mixed population zone, for example, Abkhazians and Georgians, or Georgians and Ossetians. Such a region was seen as an ideal place for igniting new, more dangerous conflicts. So the seeds of discord sown by Moscow always found fertile ground to spread. The Kremlin's next step was always to create different separatist groups and organizations. It was necessary to influence people in certain regions, or at least some of them, so they would want to break away and form their own, even unrecognized state. For this, organizational, financial, and most importantly, media support is provided. Russian propaganda heavily promoted the separatists, distorting facts to portray them as heroes and the central authorities as ruthless tyrants. Just remember the popular story from 2014 about the bloody pastor Turchinov. At the same time, there was a casting process for the leaders of the future quasi-states and their accomplices. In other words, they were forming a personnel reserve of potential collaborators. And the final touch of this stage was the formal proclamation of these very unrecognized states, for example, the Pridnestrovian Moldavian Republic, or the same Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. The third stage was a direct armed conflict in a hybrid form. Of course, Moscow naturally officially denied its involvement in the war, but provided all kinds of support to the self-proclaimed militias. At the same time, many militants were sent directly from Russia, like Gherkin Strelkov himself, and the number of such volunteers kept growing. As a result, there was a short-term local war between the separatist entities and the central authorities, with a relatively small number of casualties and destruction, usually in the range of several thousand people. The fourth stage was the open intervention of Moscow in the conflict, with the aim of protecting the entities it had created. Otherwise, government troops would have suppressed them. At the same time, Russian troops most often acted under the guise of peacekeepers. And on the international stage, the Kremlin positioned itself as an effective negotiator, a mediator, as the only force capable of resolving this situation and ending the senseless bloodshed. Essentially, the Russian authorities acted according to a well-tested old-school method. Create the problem yourself, and then solve it yourself. And the final stage in the creation of gray zones was the formal legitimization of the situation that had developed, followed by the freezing of the conflict. Legitimization took the form of referendums, elections, or some signed agreements. Meanwhile, the Kremlin was no longer interested in the legality, competitiveness, turnout, falsification rates, or other legal aspects of these elections and referendums. And on the political map of the world, unrecognized quasi-states appeared. Those very well-known gray zones. Even Russia itself didn't recognize them. I think there's no need to explain to anyone that they were nothing more than real puppets of the Moscow rulers. Finally, it should be noted that this is a universal, highly standardized plan of action for Russia. In each specific situation, it had certain specifics. For example, the second and third stages could happen simultaneously. When the creation of separatist movements was immediately accompanied by armed clashes and bloodshed, as in 2014 in Donbas. Also, Russia could use an already existing conflict, like in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, or create one literally from scratch, like in Transnistria or Donbas. And there's another point: it was much easier for Moscow to get its way if there were many ethnic Russians or local Russian-speaking residents living in the conflict area. And then the mode of, we don't abandon our own, we'll support our Russian brothers would kick in. Worn-out cliches about discrimination against Russian speakers were also actively promoted. Of course, about the need to protect them from oppression. That's why the very idea of the Russian world can be compared to a kind of virus, a biological weapon, spread in order to make it easier to seize and hold the necessary territories. Sunny Abkhazia. For those who are not familiar with geography, let me remind you that Abkhazia is located between the Black Sea coast and the slopes of the Caucasus. It is unique in its combination of sea and mountains, with a subtropical climate that is very similar to that of Crimea. That's why, back in Soviet times, resorts of all Union significance like Pitsunda and Gagra were established here. But today their former popularity is just a memory. And why is that? Yes, because Moscow stuck its long nose into local affairs. Under international law, Abkhazia is an autonomous region within Georgia. Although it wasn't always like that, the relationship between Abkhazians and Georgians has always been complicated and has often been accompanied by conflicts. So, in the 1930s, there was a forced Georgianization of the population. At the time, Georgia was ruled by Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria, our old acquaintance, who was actually a Mingrelian, not a Georgian. During the 1970s and 1980s, Abkhaz nationalism grew, leading to frequent ethnic clashes. In short, by the time the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics collapsed, everything was already set up here for Moscow's intervention, so the first point was ready. But the question arises, why does Russia even need this Abkhazia? Well, let the Georgians and Abkhazians fight among themselves. What would Russia get out of it? Why would they care about internal Caucasian conflicts? The truth is, it's about the negative attitude toward the Georgian authorities, who were represented by the first democratically elected president, Zviad Gamsahurdia. Russia was determined to maintain its influence in the Caucasus at all costs, especially in Georgia, which is why they decided to support the Abkhazians. And voila, on July 23, 1992, an unrecognized pseudo-state called the Republic of Abkhazia was created, with its capital in the city of Sukhumi. It's time for the third stage. The Georgian-Abkhazian War lasted just over a year, from August 1992 to September 1993. And as you correctly understood, many so-called volunteers from Russia fought on the Abkhazian side. Most often they operated as part of mixed units, with local Abkhazians and other Caucasians to avoid standing out. Although officially Russia declared neutrality. Units of the Russian army stationed in the region indirectly or directly supported the Abkhaz side. They supplied the separatists with the necessary weapons, ammunition, and equipment. There were also multiple recorded cases when Russian servicemen, formerly acting as volunteers, participated in combat operations. For example, Russian pilots operated aircraft that bombed Georgian positions. Though officially denied, the number of Russian fighters was only a few thousand. However, their involvement still played a significant role in Abkhazia's military successes, especially in the operation to capture Sukhumi in September 1993. This battle effectively led to Georgia's final loss of control over the rebellious region. And as a natural result, negotiations took place under the direct moderation of kind and fair Mother Russia, and the signing of the Moscow Agreements on May 14, 1944 on the ceasefire and separation of forces. This essentially meant a truce, further freezing the conflict indefinitely. And the Russian volunteers were legalized as a peacekeeping mission and even received a mandate from the United Nations Security Council. Most importantly, Moscow legally gained the right to have the 7th military base in Abkhazia's Gadauta and the Bambora military airfield. In 1994, Abkhazia adopted its constitution, and in 1999, there was one, the results of which were not even recognized by Russia. So, welcome to the Russian world. The matter was in South Ossetia. The situation with South Ossetia was basically a copy of the war in Abkhazia. For centuries, Georgians and Ossetians lived together and frequently clashed, such as during the 1918-1920 Civil War. Then the victorious Bolsheviks planted a time bomb. In 1922, Ossetia was split into North Ossetia joining Russia and South Ossetia becoming an autonomous region in Georgia. Moscow made this decision without considering the Ossetian people's views. Paradoxically, this idea belonged to a 100% Caucasian Soso Djugashvili, better known as Joseph Stalin, who at that time held the position of People's Commissar for Nationalities. If you think about it, this decision isn't paradoxical. The future dictator anticipated national liberation uprisings against Soviet power, so he preemptively divided entire peoples to weaken them. Well, yes, that's just like Iosif Vissarionovich. That's typical of him. Closer to our days, the collapse of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was approaching, and against this background, the contradictions between the Ossetians and the Georgians sharply intensified. The first serious clashes began back in 1989, and just 2 years later, full-scale fighting broke out. So the first point of the Russian strategy worked to the fullest. There is already a war, now it just needs to be maintained, thereby weakening Georgia and preserving dominant influence in the Caucasus region by creating yet another pro-Russian quasi-state entity. Therefore, on December 21, 1991, the Republic of South Ossetia was born, with its capital in the city of Tskinvali. The second point was completed, followed soon by the third, claiming to protect the Ossetian population from Georgian nationalists. From all over vast Russia, various militias, Cossacks, volunteers on leave, and other marginal scum hurried to help. At the beginning of 1992, targeted deliveries of Russian weapons and ammunition to the Ossetian separatists began, which allowed the course of hostilities to be turned in favor of the unrecognized state. From former Soviet army warehouses under Russian control, not only small arms but also artillery, tanks, and armored personnel carriers were transferred. Previously, the conflict was a slow exchange of light weapons fire, but after acquiring heavy weapons, the South Ossetian side could launch large-scale offensives. It was also recorded that attack aircraft repeatedly struck Georgian columns and positions, which paralyzed the Georgian army's ability to move reinforcements and supply their units. However, Moscow quite predictably denied all of Georgia's accusations. The legitimization of another gray zone took place on June 24, 1992, with the signing of the so-called Dagomis agreements. Once again, with Russia's mediation, a new frozen zone of instability emerged in the Caucasus, which significantly limited Georgia's sovereignty and its foreign policy ambitions. Russian occupation forces, just like in Abkhazia, received the status of peacekeeping forces, and in Skinvali, the 693rd Guards Motor Rifle Regiment was legally stationed. As for the referendums, they were held twice, in 1992 and 2006, and their results were not much different from the one in Crimea. And really, is it possible to vote any differently when you're under the barrels of Russian tanks and Kalashnikovs? That's quite a rhetorical question. Transnistria, island of misfortune. The situation in Transnistria was significantly different from the Caucasus. Here, the conflict did not have such ancient, deep-rooted origins. And by and large, it was rather initiated by Russia out of nowhere, just to keep Moldova within its sphere of influence. And once again, a bit of geography. Transnistria is a small strip of land stretching along the left bank of the Dniester River. Its natural borders are the border with Ukraine to the east and the Dniester River to the west. That's why it's called Transnistria. Purely territorially, this region made up about 12% of all of Moldova, but it had many distinctive features. During Soviet times, many industrial enterprises were built here, making Transnistria the industrial center of Moldova, similar to a mini Donbas. Secondly, many people from across the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics were drawn to these new developments and settled here. In the 1989 all-Union census, Transnistria's population was about 40% Moldovan, 28% Ukrainian, and 25% Russian. Thus, Transnistria was the only region of Moldova where the indigenous population did not have an absolute majority. This leads to the third feature. Russian, not Moldovan, was the main language in Transnistria. Intensified Russification led to Russian, not Ukrainian, becoming widespread, even though Ukrainians slightly outnumbered others. And in the upcoming Transnistrian conflict, ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking Ukrainians acted together against the Moldovans. That's quite an ethnic paradox. By the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' collapse, this situation had developed. Most of Moldova was mainly an agricultural but monoethnic country where Moldovans made up on average 80–90% depending on the specific region. The exception was Gagauzia, but we will most likely make a separate video about it. And the industrially developed Transnistria looked like a kind of Russian-speaking enclave, completely different from other parts of Moldova. So the first step had already been taken. But, as you already understand, having the prerequisites for a conflict doesn't necessarily mean that a conflict will happen. If Moscow hadn't interfered in Moldova's internal affairs, it's quite possible that there wouldn't have been any war or gray zone at all. And Transnistria would have received broad economic and national cultural autonomy, following the example of Gagauzia or Ukrainian Crimea. The Kremlin unexpectedly began turning Transnistria against the central authorities, repeatedly warning them about Moldovan nationalists. With stories about the infringement of the rights of Russian speakers and so on. Plus, by artificially pitting Moldovan peasants against the city dwellers from Transnistria, they were deliberately emphasizing how backward most of Moldova was. They also worked on the local party elites, convincing them of the benefits of separating from Moldova and creating their own full-fledged republic. And this targeted anti-Moldovan propaganda gradually brought success. As a result, on September 2nd, 1990, the creation of the Pridnestrovian Moldavian Republic was proclaimed, with its capital in Tiraspol. The circle was complete. However, at first, the third stage did not begin, the townspeople. The conflict began a year and a half late, and for a while, it even seemed that everything would be resolved peacefully just by war. Moldova does not recognize the sovereignty of Transnistria, and Transnistria does not recognize the authority of Moldova over itself. In principle, you can still live like that, but Russia wouldn't be Russia. A campfire, or someone might add a little gasoline. The war in Transnistria lasted from March to August 1992, and it was the Russian side that played the decisive role in it. First, the militias, Cossacks, and other fringe groups were given weapons, equipment, and ammunition. Among them, by the way, was our old acquaintance Gherkin Strelkov, who actually joined the self-proclaimed Cossacks. Transnistria became his real baptism by fire. However, even pumping Transnistria with material and human resources brought only moderate success. Moldovan troops kept the strategic initiative, and in order to prevent the destruction of its puppet, Moscow decided to act openly, using the 14th Army which had been stationed in Transnistria since Soviet times, led by Alexander Lebed. The very same General Lebed who, 4 years later, signed the shameful Khasavyurt agreements with Chechnya. In 1992, Moldova was again forced to sign shameful agreements. The Russian President Yeltsin? On July 21, an agreement was signed that ended the Transnistrian War by effectively freezing the conflict and legalizing Russian troops as peacekeepers. Practically, just like in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, Moscow acted in exactly the same way. And as for the referendums, over the past 35 years there have been as many as 7 of them. The last one occurred in 2006. At that time, the residents of Transnistria, tired of living in an unrecognized republic, voted to join Russia as a new subject of the Federation. However, Russia itself is not really eager to annex an unprofitable and poor region that it absolutely does not need. So much for we don't abandon our own, right on the mark. The failed Novorossiya. The situation with Donbas is both similar to and different from previous gray zones. On the one hand, it was in 2014 that hybrid aggression was demonstrated in all its glory, using modern methods of manipulation and information and communication technologies. For example, whole troll and bot factories on social networks. Also, in Donbas, there were the same Cossacks and vacationers, under whose guise professionally trained militants like Gherkin were hiding. On the other hand, the scale of the war itself and the number of casualties sharply set this conflict apart from all the previous ones. Before Russia's 2022 invasion, around 14,500 people, both soldiers and civilians, died in Donbas. This is similar to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' losses in the Afghan War, though those were only military. In lesser-known wars like the Transnistrian conflict, just over 1,000 people died on both sides. But an even more important difference is that the conflict in Donbas was never fully frozen. The fighting continued even after the well-known Minsk agreements were signed, sometimes with greater, sometimes with lesser intensity. Shootouts continued for 7 years until Putin finally dropped his mask. The occupying Russian troops never even received the formal status of peacekeepers. Moreover, up until February 24, 2022, the Russian authorities completely denied the presence of their army in eastern Ukraine. Another significant difference is that initially the Russian authorities had somewhat different goals than they did in Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and Transnistria. When organizing the so-called Russian Spring, they did not intend to create a gray zone, but rather to destroy the Ukrainian state from within by creating people's republics and further federalizing Ukraine. Back then, this was called the Novorossiya project. The fact that only the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic were nurtured ultimately highlights the Kremlin's strategic failure. Neither in Kharkiv, nor in Odessa, nor in Kherson, nor in other cities of southeastern Ukraine were Russian agents able to seize power. And even then it became clear. We came up with a new plan. A project to push these so-called republics back into Ukraine, which in fact was the main purpose of the second Minsk agreements. But overall, everything happened according to the Kremlin's guidelines. The only difficult part was the first point. Since even in Donbas there were few ethnic Russians, and most of the local Russian-speaking residents did not want to separate from Ukraine. Therefore, the focus was not on the national factor, like in the Caucasus, but on the regional factor, artificially pitting the industrial East against the more agrarian West, stirring up miners and metallurgists, against the so-called Banderites hiding in forests. They used completely outdated Soviet and post-Soviet myths. Just remember how Russian propaganda drilled into people's heads that supposedly Donbas doesn't mess around. And Galicians are nothing more than freeloaders, living only off tourism and earnings from abroad. And on top of that, they added the factor of the victorious Euromaidan, stories about the bloody rights sector and other nationalist organizations. And now everything is ready, the Russian Spring in all its glory. There were certain problems with the second point, since there were few people who seriously wanted to separate from Ukraine, even among the local elite, which mostly consisted of members of the Party of Regions. Sure, to protest against Kyiv, to bargain for some financial preferences for themselves, to tell the naive people about granting Russian the status of a second state language, that was easy for them. Very few people wanted to fully separate from Ukraine, and even fewer wanted to fight for the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. Marginal figures such as Deputy Oleg Tsaryov. That's why separatist leaders were brought in from Russia, like Alexander Borodai, the first Donetsk People's Republic Prime Minister and a previously little-known Moscow political strategist. Further stages also took place. The artificially provoked war in Donbas brought its bloody results, and to save its creations from complete defeat, Moscow sent in its troops. However, this time it was done secretly, without publicizing its involvement. This resulted in the infamous Ilovaisk encirclement. Recently, legitimization continued through the signing of the Minsk agreements and the so-called elections in the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. But again, let me repeat, the conflict in Donbas was not frozen. Even though Russian strategists made considerable efforts to turn Ukraine into one big Novorossiya. And in this they failed. The Kremlin dwarf, after listening to the loyal intelligence reports, finally imagined himself as Adolf Aloisovich and gave the order to prepare the special military operation. However, that's a completely different story. Gray zones exist. What's next? A logical question comes up. What happens to these gray zones after they exist? I'll say this. The fate of unrecognized quasi-states is almost always the same. Therefore, we can say with 100% certainty that the following 5 steps were taken by the Kremlin to maintain and control them. Stage 1. Passportization of the population, that is, granting the residents of these unrecognized states Russian citizenship, most often in a somewhat simplified form. The goal is as clear as day, so that Moscow has a rock-solid reason to step in and support its puppets, if, of course, they are ever threatened. The logic is simple. Now our citizens live there, which means they must be protected at all costs. According to official data, the highest level of passportization is observed in the Caucasus. Currently, over 90% of Abkhazia and South Ossetia residents hold Russian citizenship, compared to about 60% in Transnistria. This is because this gray zone is the only one among them that does not share a common border with Russia. Moldovan and Ukrainian passports are more common here, but having a Romanian passport is best since it lets you travel freely throughout the European Union. The lowest result, about 20–30%, was in the Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic because the simplified passport procedure only became available in 2019. Moscow reportedly tried until the end to return these regions to Ukraine. In 2022, after the invasion and annexation, nearly all residents of occupied Ukrainian territories were forced to become Russian citizens. There was no other way to survive. So in the case of Donbas, the Russian passport turned from a privilege into a kind of punishment. Stage 2, cultural integration, which takes the form of blatant Russification. This is Russia's old playbook. Simply handing out passports isn't enough in conquered territories. It's necessary for the newly minted Russian citizen to truly feel Russian. The mandatory use of Russian as the state language is introduced, applied everywhere, especially in schools and educational institutions. Moscow also claims to support and protect local languages like Abkhaz, Ossetian, Moldovan, and Ukrainian. In reality, this is just a facade. The third stage follows the second and involves processing information and propaganda for the local population. For this, Russian television channels are connected to the mandatory channel, most often via satellite. And of course, the internet. How could there be censorship without it? But unlike in Russia itself, where the main focus is on technically blocking prohibited digital platforms, in the gray zones more attention is given to self-censorship. That is, journalists, bloggers, and ordinary citizens are simply afraid to say or write anything extra. Otherwise, plainclothes officers will handle them seriously. In Abkhazia, it's the State Security Service. In South Ossetia, as in Soviet times, the State Security Committee. And in Transnistria, the Ministry of State Security. They're like mini versions of the Federal Security Service. The fourth point involves the complete economic subordination of the unrecognized state to Russia. This subordination has two opposing aspects at the same time. On one hand, Moscow exercises direct control over any economic processes in the gray zones, trying to extract benefits for itself. For example, Russian oligarchs buying up land in the resort areas of Abkhazia for cheap using frontmen. On the other hand, Russia provides certain financial assistance to the local population to maintain their loyalty. Just like a dealer gets another client hooked. However, first of all, this kind of assistance is never enough to cover basic needs, and secondly, because of the deep corruption of the ruling regimes. The money allocated ends up exclusively in the pockets of those in power. Ordinary people get nothing but crumbs. Meanwhile, the local economy in these gray zones often looks like a medieval barter system. Fueled by smuggling, Russia invests nothing in developing its puppets. And why would it? Let them stay poor and without hope for a better future. After all, it's easiest to control such downtrodden and embittered masses. Well, and the final stage consists of constant political control by Moscow over the local elites, suppressing any forms of protest and dissent. Most importantly, always be ready. And that's the appeal of these so-called gray zones. You can never be sure that old wounds which have just healed won't open up again and the region won't be seized. A new war. That's what happened in South Ossetia in 2008 when Russia provoked the second war with Georgia and finally buried everything. President Saakashvili's plans to restore the country's sovereignty and territorial integrity are always ruthlessly demonstrated by the Kremlin. No one can lay claim to territory that it considers its own. And that's final. Woe to the undefeated. What more can you add? I don't think anything. For Russia, all these gray zones are nothing more than tools to achieve their goals, and the local residents are nothing more than expendable material. These pseudo-state entities serve as buffer zones, allowing the Kremlin to control neighboring countries, undermine their sovereignty, and prevent integration into NATO and the European Union, as well as other Western structures. And their population to live alone, poor and corrupt. The future prospects of these gray zones' existence are directly tied to Moscow's ability to keep them at least in a half-dead state. If Kremlin power weakens, Russia could fall into chaos and a new time of troubles, or new tsars may drastically change foreign policy. That's when there will be a real chance for these quasi-states to disappear. And it doesn't necessarily have to be through military means. In a situation where Moscow loses control over what's happening on the ground and stops funding its own creations, then the local elites will make concessions. Right now, of course, this scenario seems completely unrealistic, but you never know. We're living in a time when things that seemed absurd just 5 years ago are becoming possible. Meanwhile, Russia and its proxies are spreading fear and instability in the Caucasus and Moldova. And in the case of Ukraine, a full-scale war on a scale not seen since World War II. Moscow is not capable of anything more than that, of creating something useful. Isn't that somehow un-Russian, you know? And not just in the occupied territories, but even at home. We must always remember this. Well, that's all from me. Thank you for watching, and thanks to all the channel sponsors for your financial support. See you in the next episode. Goodbye, everyone.